So Halloween is coming up in just a couple of days, and I figured I'd sort of get into the spooky mood by sharing a couple of tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years of writing horror and horror adjacent fiction. I also dressed up like a pumpkin because I can, and I think I look really cute. Okay, so getting more into this topic, even though I'm definitely like a coward.
And I'm not a coward!
I actually find myself writing quite a bit of horror, though none of it is really pure. Like, it's not pure horror books, it's horror fantasy or horror comedy. Just horror adjacent or subgenres of horror really appeal to me, especially in the past couple of years. I feel like particularly in literary spaces, horror is something that gets brushed aside or looked over almost. But honestly, a really good horror book has the potential to stick with you in a way that I feel like no other genre really can. Anyway, I'm sort of weird, so I've done a lot of research into what makes horror so effective, or at least good horror, and I figured I'd share some of my findings with you guys. So let's get started with these 9 tips and tricks for writing effective horror. Tip number 1 is to tap into your own fears and lived experiences. This is just really common writing advice across the board. Obviously, write what you know is one of the most cliche writing tips that you can ever find out in there in the wild. Honestly, even though I don't necessarily prescribe to the write what you know advice for other things, because I write a lot of spec fic in particular, it's super important for horror. And I feel like this advice sort of gets misconstrued as like, you should only write your own life experiences, what's happened to you personally, which is why it's brushed aside in spec fic. But I sort of see it as advice that tells you to tap into your emotions, your development, I almost said character development, but your approach to things. You want to draw the emotional depths of your story from a place that you actually have experienced personally, so it's more true to you. So even if you're writing a story about fighting a demon, which I mean, like, I hope you've never had to do, what you want to draw from is that experience of fear that you have felt in your life in a different situation, if that makes sense. And honestly, if you're writing horror and you're not at least a little bit unsettled by what you're writing, I think you might be doing it wrong. Also, when you're thinking about your own personal fears, I feel like it's sort of to draw from the obvious things like fear of dogs, fear of spiders, fear of car crashes. Think about the deeper fears that you may have. Horror is honestly at its best when there's that undercurrent of existential dread. So we're thinking about like fear of failure, loss of control, that sort of thing, the big fears. And I'll be circling back to this concept in a little bit, but basically just think about what is the underlying true fear. You're not afraid of a ghost, you're afraid of the unknown. You're not afraid of a demon. Someone is laughing outside. You know, symbolism, theme, all that good stuff. Tip number 2 is to make your perspective close. I'm like doing so many hand gestures. I'm so sorry. Anyway, my second tip is to make your perspective close. I think it's really super important to put your reader into the character's shoes. And honestly, I think this is part of why horror movies are almost always a scarier experience than books, and video games even more so. Oh my god. Because like most human beings are visual people or very sensory, so we experience things better if we're seeing them or, you know, in a game hearing them, just sort of immersing ourselves in that moment through all our senses. And it's a lot easier to do that with films and television, obviously, because you're not having to imagine the situation based off of words on a page. So writers are faced with this challenge of creating so immersive an experience through words alone that the reader actually like fears for their life. Wait, no, that the reader experiences true fear. And that's really tricky. The trick to this, if you can swing it, is to pull the perspective as close and tight as possible. I think this is why a lot of horror protagonists and main characters are everymen and are very boring and basic and tend to not have a lot going for them as characters, because they're designed to be that paper doll for the reader to draw themselves onto. Honestly, I don't know where I was going with that metaphor, but you know what I mean, so we're moving on. My third tip is to not get too schlocky with the violence and gore. This might be like controversial, but I personally find that unless you're going for that whole final destination, like over the top, almost hilarious gore aspect. Yeah, a lot of the time, if you're going overboard, it just comes off as ridiculous and zany. You risk desensitizing the reader to what's going on. So honestly, most of the time, a smaller act of violence is like far more visceral than someone getting decapitated or split in half or whatever else. Like, think about reading about someone getting their head cut off versus someone snapping their finger in half or biting down on a rusty nail or like ripping their fingernails out. Like, that is so much worse because it is localized. Honestly, like, I don't even know why it's worse, but the small things can be really effective. Obviously, grand gestures of violence have their time and place, but I feel like those should be your big dramatic moments as opposed to what you're basing or hinging your horror experience off of, what you're building the story off of. I don't know, that's just my 2 cents. Tip number 4 is to do your research. I feel like spec-fic authors, speculative fiction authors, maybe don't like research as much as they should sometimes because they're like, I'm making it up, so I'll just make it up. For horror, and especially gory horror, it really bothers me as someone who's sort of medical field adjacent when there's like an injury that shouldn't kill the person or should kill the person and doesn't, or does and it doesn't make sense, or if like blood is spurting and that doesn't make sense. A lot of the violence in movies and TV cannot be counted on. You can't base your experience off of that. Yeah, I just think like if you're going to be doing anything medical, like just know what's real and what's just some misconception that we have from television. Like you don't have to go ahead and watch a bunch of surgery videos. I know that's like not everyone's cup of tea, which I don't get, but whatever. Maybe like just do it for me. Like if I'm reading your thing and the medical stuff is inaccurate, I'm just gonna be annoyed. So also sort of in this vein of doing your research, if your horror has anything to do with like ghosts or demons or other entities that people actually believe exist, then I recommend looking up true encounters. Whether or not you believe in the validity of them, there's a lot of like scary shit in there. Some of the best horror writing you can find is in those encounters. I'm not joking. Tip number 5 is to just keep in mind that humans actually really fear the unknown. We're scared of ghosts because to date, like a lot of people still aren't fucking sure if they're real or not. We're scared of the dark because we don't know what's in there. We don't know if the lump we're seeing in the corner is our desk chair or like a murderer. See, I feel like over-explaining your horror monster, ghost, or whatever sort of takes away the fear. So yeah, take advantage of our innate fear of the unknown. Tip number 6 is to make your reader paranoid with the power of pacing. So going back to my Hill House example, Mike Flanagan does this really cool thing where he uses long panning shots to sort of like make you fear for your life. You're sort of like surreptitiously checking every shadow to make sure it's not moving. Sometimes you see something move out of the corner of your eye, or a painting is different from the shot before. I don't really know how to put that into words, but you should utilize that. That type of pacing of making your reader unsure of what's going to happen next. The suspense pacing, basically. It's really powerful if you're able to keep your reader on their toes and then bust out the scary thing when they're sort of least expecting it. But there is a lot of power in making your reader fear without actually doing anything or having anything jump out or happen in that moment. And honestly, like this is a matter of opinion, but I feel like this is more effective than just busting out scare after scare and making them desensitized and like not care as much anymore because they're almost expecting it. They're expecting to be spooked in that way. My 7th tip is to think about theme and don't be afraid to get meta with it. I feel like this goes more into like, again, my ghosts and demon fixation. I don't really think about slasher horror that much because it's just not really my thing. So we're thinking about why are we afraid of ghosts? Why are the characters afraid of these ghosts in particular? Like, yes, all ghosts are scary, so we're thinking about a one big true fear as opposed to just being afraid of the ghost in the house. Theme is really important in horror, like way more important than people think. I feel like it is one of the most simple genres in terms of thematic expression and cohesion, because it is a lot of this focus on just one singular large fear being manifested in the form of a demon or a ghost. All these monsters come from things that previous generations had an innate fear of, like witches, powerful women, ghosts, death itself. Once you sort of are keyed into that mindset, it becomes a lot easier to craft your own sort of beasts or ghosts or whatever entities based around a singular large fear. Honestly, I think that's one of the aspects about horror that I love the most. I love thinking about theme. I love considering it, especially in genre work. The fact that horror has so consistently utilized it is like just really cool to me. So my 8th tip is to not forsake the entire story or a story as a whole for the sake of a couple of scares. Again, and sort of touching back on my point about theme, good horror, just like everything else, has to have a good story to support it. That means solid, relatively coherent plot structure, thematic cohesion, solid prose, like relatively compelling characters. I feel like the ghosts and demons and murderers, if you have them, can be the more interesting of the characters as opposed to like the victim set, but characters nonetheless. Tip number 9, which sort of relates to this, is your ending also matters. A tendency that a lot of horror has is to just not really have an ending that means anything or says anything important, which like your story doesn't necessarily always have to say something important. That's, you know, ridiculous. We would never get anything done if that were the case. I think you should at least try to say something or try to have some sort of conclusion beyond just like, everyone died or they got away, you know, and that's the end of it. Like, what did your characters learn from the experience, or what should we take away from the experience? What does this story say about, you know, the one true big fear, I keep doing this and like, I don't know why. What does the conclusion of your story say about that one true big fear? Endings for me have always been one of the most challenging parts of writing and crafting a story. So this is no exception. Horror especially, I feel like it's tough to come away feeling satisfied and not just like scared. And I feel like this is how a story lingers with you. You remember the ending the most, unless it's a bad ending, you know? Okay, I think that about covers it. I don't know how long that was, but I guess I'll figure it out in editing. Thank you so much for watching. I upload a new video every Thursday. I haven't skipped a single week yet. So subscribe to keep up with all of my like writing videos. I'm also doing NaNoWriMo starting next week. Wait, what? That is too soon. That is too soon for that. And one of the projects I'm working on is a horror comedy, so I'll be utilizing a lot of these tips as I'm moving forward with it. So basically for the month of November, I think my plan is, unless I can like pump out a script, which I don't think I can, I'll just be like making little update videos. Maybe I'll do a couple vlogs if I have the time. Anyway, that was a lot of useless information, but thank you again for watching, and I will see you guys next week.